Buffalo County, Nebraska, September 1884. While every homesteader raced to throw up basic sod houses in 3 to 4 days, one German immigrant was still digging. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Klaus Steinberg excavated his foundation 4 feet deep and 8 feet wider than necessary, hauling wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of prairie fieldstone to line his oversized basement. He spent 3 weeks on elaborate foundation work, while others completed entire houses for under $3. Local homesteader Jim Morrison shook his head. "Klaus, you're building a root cellar, not a house." But Steinberg kept digging, creating an underground thermal mass system with 18 inches of sand and gravel topped with flat fieldstones. Then January 12, 1887 arrived. The killing cold hit. Temperatures plunged below 20 below zero and stayed there for 6 straight weeks. Standard sod houses became death traps, with interior temperatures dropping to 20 to 30 degrees despite burning furniture and books. But Steinberg's house? It stayed a comfortable 65 degrees using half the fuel of his neighbors. His underground stones stored heat from evening fires and released it through the night. What did this Bavarian stonemason understand about thermal mass and heat storage that could mean the difference between survival and death on the wind-scoured prairie? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The September wind cut across Buffalo County's endless grassland with the promise of winter, and Klaus Steinberg could feel it in his bones. At 42, the German stonemason had survived enough Bavarian winters to recognize the signs, the particular bite in the air that meant serious cold was coming, the kind that killed the unprepared. Around him, his new neighbors worked with the frantic energy of men racing against time, throwing up their sod houses with practiced efficiency born of 3 years' homesteading experience. Jim Morrison, whose claim bordered Steinberg's to the east, had cut his sod bricks the week before, neat rectangles of prairie earth held together by buffalo grass roots, each brick measuring 12 inches by 18 inches and 3 inches thick. Morrison's technique was flawless, learned from the homesteaders who'd survived the harsh winter of 1881. Stack the bricks grass side down, pack the joints with loose earth, frame the windows and doors with precious lumber hauled from the railroad 40 miles south, and cap it all with a sod roof supported by a central ridge beam. Total construction time, 3 days. Total cost, $2.78 for window glass and door hardware. The Henderson family, newcomers from Illinois like most of this year's arrivals, followed Morrison's lead exactly. Their 18-inch thick sod walls rose with mechanical precision, each course carefully laid and packed. Mrs. Henderson had already begun planning her interior arrangements, calculating how to fit 3 children and their belongings into the 12 by 16-foot space that would shelter them through whatever winter Nebraska could deliver. Her husband worked with the confident efficiency of a man following proven methods that had kept the Morrison family alive and comfortable through 2 previous winters. But Klaus Steinberg wasn't cutting sod. Instead, he stood in a hole that seemed to grow deeper each day, his pick striking the hard-packed prairie earth with methodical persistence. The excavation stretched 24 feet by 18 feet, far larger than the 16 by 12 house he planned to build. More puzzling still, the hole went down 4 feet, well below any reasonable foundation depth for a simple sod house. "Klaus, what in hell are you building down there?" Morrison called out on the 5th day of digging, pausing in his own roof construction to watch his neighbor haul another wheelbarrow of dirt up from the expanding pit. "You digging for China?" Steinberg looked up, sweat streaking his face despite the cool September air. His English, learned hastily during the 3-month journey from New York to Nebraska, came slowly but with unmistakable certainty. "In Bavaria, we build for winter, not just for summer." He gestured toward the pile of fieldstone he'd been collecting from the scattered glacial deposits that dotted the prairie. "This will keep my family warm when your fire dies in the night." The explanation satisfied no one. Mrs. Henderson, hanging washing on the line between her house and the Steinberg claim, shook her head at the waste of precious building time. "That man's going to freeze his family while the rest of us are snug in proper houses," she told her husband. "Mark my words, he'll be begging to share our fire come December." Morrison was more direct in his criticism. "You're overthinking this, Klaus. These Nebraska winters aren't Bavaria. We've got it figured out here. Build fast, build cheap, build what works. You're burning daylight on fancy stonework when you should be cutting sod." But Steinberg continued his methodical excavation, and as the hole reached its final 4-foot depth, his true intentions became clear. The immigrant began lining the pit with carefully selected fieldstone, creating walls 18 inches thick that extended down to the bottom of his excavation. Each stone was chosen for specific properties. Dense granite-like rocks that would hold heat, fitted together with the precision of a man who'd learned his craft heating medieval castle foundations. The stonework alone took 8 days, while around him his neighbors completed entire houses. The Henderson family moved into their finished sod house on September 28th. Morrison hosted them for a celebration dinner, proudly showing off his 18-inch thick walls and commenting pointedly on the empty pit where Steinberg's house should stand. "Look at that foundation," Morrison said, gesturing toward Steinberg's stone-lined excavation. "He's got enough rock down there to build a church. What's he planning, to house his whole family underground like prairie dogs?" Anna Steinberg, hanging clothes near enough to overhear, finally spoke up. Her English was better than her husband's, sharpened by necessity during their immigrant journey. In the old country, Klaus's buildings stood 200 years. His grandfather heated the stones beneath castle floors, kept noble families warm through alpine winters that make Nebraska look like spring. She fixed Morrison with a steady gaze. "When the real cold comes, you'll understand why he digs deep." The technical details of Steinberg's system remained mysterious to his neighbors, but the basic elements were becoming visible. After completing his stone foundation walls, he filled the interior space with 18 inches of sand and gravel, creating a drainage layer that would prevent moisture problems while providing a stable base for the stones above. Then came the crucial element. Flat field stones carefully selected and fitted to create a thermal mass floor that would sit directly beneath his future house. By early October, while his neighbors enjoyed the comfort of completed homes, Steinberg finally began laying his first sod bricks. But even his above-ground construction deviated from local practice. His sod walls, built on the massive stone foundation that extended 2 feet above ground level, incorporated traditional German techniques adapted to prairie materials. The foundation stones would store heat from his fires and release it slowly through the floor, creating a radiant heating system powered by the same corn cobs and buffalo chips. His neighbors burned far less efficiently. Morrison watched the final construction with grudging curiosity. "I'll give you this, Klaus. That's the most elaborate sod house foundation I've ever seen. But winter's coming fast, and all that fancy stonework better keep you warmer than my simple walls because you've spent a month on what the rest of us finished in 3 days." The German immigrant looked up from his sod laying, his hands still steady despite weeks of backbreaking labor. "Mine grandfather always said, 'Prepare for the worst winter, not the average winter. This foundation will store the heat of today's fire and give it back tomorrow morning.'" He gestured toward the massive thermal mass beneath his rising walls. "When the killing cold comes, these stones will remember every fire I've built, and they'll keep my family warm long after your fires die to ashes." By late October, Klaus Steinberg's sod house finally stood complete. Its walls rising from the massive stone foundation that had consumed so much precious autumn building time. The structure looked deceptively similar to his neighbors' homes, the same 18-inch thick sod walls, the same careful window and door framing, the same practical 12 by 16-foot interior dimensions. But beneath the familiar exterior lay 8,000 pounds of carefully selected fieldstone, arranged in a thermal mass system that would soon prove its worth against the Nebraska cold. The first hard freeze arrived November 15th, dropping nighttime temperatures to 10 degrees below zero and catching several homesteading families unprepared for winter's early assault. Jim Morrison woke that morning to find ice coating the inside of his water bucket, despite banking his fire the night before with enough fuel to last until dawn. The Morrison family huddled around their heating stove, burning precious corn cobs to rewarm their house after the overnight temperature drop that had chilled their interior to near freezing. In the Henderson house, the situation was similar but worse. Their inexperience with prairie heating showed in the frost that coated their windows and the ice that had formed along the base of their north wall. Henderson burned 4 wheelbarrows of twisted grass hay that morning, desperately trying to restore comfortable temperatures, while his children shivered under every blanket the family owned. But smoke rising from Klaus Steinberg's chimney told a different story. His small heating stove, positioned directly over the center of his stone foundation, had burned a modest fire the previous evening, 2 armloads of corn cobs that heated not just the interior air, but the massive stone thermal mass beneath his floor. Through the night, as outside temperatures plummeted, those heated stones continued releasing their stored energy upward through the stone floor, maintaining interior temperatures that never dropped below 60 degrees. Anna Steinberg woke that November morning to find her family comfortable under light blankets, the stone floor warm beneath her feet, despite the killing cold outside. When she looked through frost-free windows, she could see her neighbors' chimneys smoking desperately as they fought to rewarm houses that had lost their heat to the prairie wind. Morrison, hauling his 4th wheelbarrow of fuel before noon, noticed the difference immediately. "Klaus's chimney is barely smoking," he told his wife. "Either he's got better fuel than the rest of us, or that German's family is freezing and too proud to admit it." But when Morrison walked past the Steinberg house that afternoon, he could hear the children playing inside, their voices carrying the easy contentment of warmth rather than the hushed tones of a family conserving heat. Through the window, he glimpsed Klaus sitting comfortably at his table, working on harness repairs without the heavy coat Morrison wore even inside his own house. The fuel consumption differences became impossible to ignore as November cold persisted. Morrison tracked his daily requirements carefully, 4 wheelbarrows of corn cobs and buffalo chips to maintain barely livable temperatures, with constant fire tending required to prevent dangerous overnight cooling. The Henderson family, less experienced with fuel management, burned through 5 wheelbarrows daily and still struggled with interior frost formation. Steinberg's consumption remained mysteriously low. His chimney smoked for perhaps 3 hours each evening, then went cold through the night while his neighbors maintained round-the-clock fires. Yet his windows showed no frost, no ice buildup, no signs of the thermal distress plaguing every other house in the area. Dr. Thomas Whitmore, making his weekly rounds to check on scattered homestead families, began noticing the pattern during his late November visits. The physician carried a mercury thermometer calibrated for extreme cold, and his professional curiosity was piqued by the dramatic differences he observed between houses built using identical materials and methods. Morrison's house at 7 in the morning, 42 degrees, with ice visible on the interior walls despite a fire burning all night. Henderson's house, 38 degrees, with the family sleeping in coats and sharing blankets around their heating stove. Steinberg's house, 64 degrees, with the family sleeping comfortably under normal bedding while no fire burned at all. When Whitmore asked Steinberg to explain his heating system, the German immigrant led him to the stone floor and knelt down, placing his palm against the smooth fieldstone surface. "Feel here, doctor. The stones are still warm from yesterday's fire. In Bavaria, we call this spiker the stones that remember heat and give it back slowly." Whitmore pressed his own hand to the floor and felt the gentle warmth radiating upward through the stone. The thermal mass system was releasing heat that had been stored 12 hours earlier, when Steinberg's evening fire had heated the 8,000 pounds of fieldstone to nearly 90 degrees. As outside temperatures dropped through the night, the stones had gradually released their stored energy, maintaining comfortable interior conditions without burning a single additional piece of fuel. The science behind the system remained mysterious to Steinberg's neighbors, but the results were undeniable. The Germans' thermal mass foundation stored approximately 1,680 BTUs of heat energy for every degree of temperature rise. A single evening fire could heat those stones enough to warm the house for 10 to 12 hours, while conventional heating methods lost their energy to the prairie wind within minutes of the fire dying down. By December, word of Steinberg's fuel efficiency had spread throughout Buffalo County's scattered homestead community. Traveling preachers and mail carriers brought reports of the German immigrant whose house stayed warm all night using half the fuel his neighbors burned around the clock. Some dismissed these stories as exaggeration or attributed Steinberg's success to superior fuel quality or hidden coal supplies smuggled in from the railroad. Morrison remained skeptical but curious. On December 10th, when temperatures dropped to 15 below zero, he walked over to investigate Steinberg's system firsthand. The German welcomed his neighbor inside, where Morrison found the family eating breakfast in comfortable shirt sleeves, while his own family huddled in coats around their stove. "Klaus, I've got to ask, what's your fuel secret? My stove's been burning since 4 this morning, and my house is still cold enough to see your breath. Your fire's been out all night, but it's warm as spring in here." Steinberg gestured toward the stone floor beneath their feet. "No secret, Jim. Just old knowledge from the old country. These stones under the floor, they hold yesterday's fire and give it to today's morning. Tonight I build small fire, heat the stones. Tomorrow morning, the stones heat the house while you are still lighting your stove." Morrison knelt and felt the warm stone floor, beginning to understand the thermal mass principle that his hasty autumn construction had ignored. The foundation that he had mocked as wasteful European overthinking was actually a sophisticated heat storage system that could stretch a single fire's energy across 12 hours of bitter cold. As December's cold deepened toward the winter that would test every homesteader's survival skills, Morrison found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about prairie heating. The Germans' excessive preparation was looking less foolish with each sub-zero night that left conventional sod houses struggling to maintain life-sustaining temperatures. January 12th, 1887 brought weather that would enter Nebraska folklore as the beginning of the Great Die-Up, though the homesteaders of Buffalo County had no way of knowing they were witnessing the opening act of the most catastrophic winter in Great Plains history. The mercury dropped to 28 below zero that morning and kept falling, settling into a cold so severe that breath froze before it left a man's mouth and spit crackled when it hit the ground. By January 20th, the thermometer outside Dr. Whitmore's office registered 35 below zero, and it had not climbed above 20 below for 8 consecutive days. The killing cold had arrived with a vengeance that made previous Nebraska winters seem like mild autumn weather, and the scattered homestead families found themselves fighting for survival with heating systems designed for normal frontier conditions, not this polar assault. Jim Morrison's house became a battlefield against the cold. Despite burning continuously through day and night, his interior temperature dropped to 28 degrees by dawn each morning. Ice formed along the interior walls in thick sheets, and the family's water bucket froze solid despite sitting within 3 feet of their heating stove. Morrison burned everything combustible, furniture legs sawed off tables and chairs, books fed page by page into the flames, even interior door frames pried loose and sacrificed to the desperate need for heat. Maria Morrison moved the family's mattresses directly beside the stove, creating a survival huddle where the children slept in their coats under every blanket they owned. The family measured their fuel in hours rather than days, calculating how long each piece of furniture would burn and whether they could stretch their dwindling supply of corn cobs and buffalo chips until the cold broke. The Henderson family faced even worse conditions. Their inexperience with extreme cold management showed in every frozen surface of their house. Ice coated the interior walls from floor to ceiling, and frost formed so thickly on their windows that daylight barely penetrated the interior gloom. Henderson had begun burning structural elements of his own house, first the interior partitions that divided their single room, then sections of sod brick dried specifically for emergency fuel. Mrs. Henderson wrapped her 3 children in a single large buffalo robe and kept them pressed against her body for warmth while her husband fed their stove with anything that would burn. The kitchen table disappeared piece by piece, followed by the chairs, then the wooden crates that had carried their belongings from Illinois. By January 25th, with temperatures holding steady at 30 below zero, the Henderson family was burning their own floorboards. 3 miles away, Klaus Steinberg's thermal mass system faced the ultimate test of its design principles. The massive stone foundation beneath his house, 8,000 pounds of carefully selected fieldstone, had been storing and releasing heat for 2 months, proving its efficiency during normal cold snaps. But temperatures of 35 below zero pushed every heating system beyond its normal operational limits. Each evening, Steinberg built his fire with methodical precision, loading his stove with enough fuel to heat his foundation stones to their maximum safe temperature without cracking the thermal mass. The heated stones reached nearly 100 degrees, storing enough energy to warm his 16 by 12-foot house for 12 to 14 hours. Even when outside temperatures dropped below -30, his interior never fell below 60 degrees. The fuel consumption difference became a matter of life and death. While Morrison burned 6 wheelbarrows of combustible material daily to maintain barely survivable conditions, Steinberg used 2 wheelbarrows to keep his family comfortable. The thermal mass system's efficiency meant the difference between burning furniture to survive and sleeping peacefully under normal bedding. Dr. Spree. Whitmore's temperature measurements during the crisis provided stark documentation of the heating system performance gap. On January 28th, with outside temperatures at 32 below zero, he recorded interior conditions at 7 in the morning. Morrison House, 24 degrees with thick ice on the walls. Henderson House, 22 degrees with frost covering every surface. Steinberg House, 62 degrees with no ice formation anywhere. The crisis deepened as February arrived with no sign of moderation. Temperatures remained below 20 degrees below zero for 6 straight weeks, creating survival conditions that homestead heating systems had never been designed to handle. The Henderson family reached their breaking point first. When 8-year-old Sarah Henderson showed early signs of frostbite despite sleeping inside their house, Mrs. Henderson swallowed her pride and walked through the bitter cold to Anna Steinberg's door. "My children are freezing in their own beds," she said simply. "Could they sleep by your stove tonight?" Anna Steinberg opened her door immediately, welcoming the Henderson children into the warmth radiating from Klaus's thermal mass floor. The contrast was immediate and dramatic. The Henderson children, who had been shivering under buffalo robes in their parents' house, played comfortably on Steinberg's warm stone floor, wearing only their regular clothes. Mrs. Henderson felt heat rising through her shoes from the stones beneath, and realized she was experiencing something completely different from conventional heating, not just warmed air that disappeared the moment a fire died, but thermal mass that stored yesterday's heat and released it slowly through the coldest nights. Within days, the Morrison family faced their own crisis. Maria Morrison collapsed from cold exposure while trying to tend their fire at 4 in the morning, her body temperature dropping dangerously low despite being inside their house. Jim Morrison, the man who had mocked Steinberg's elaborate foundation work, found himself knocking on his neighbor's door in the pre-dawn darkness. "Klaus, I need help," Morrison said, his words forming ice crystals in the bitter air. "Maria's not well, and we can't keep our house warm enough to keep her safe." Steinberg's response was immediate and generous. "Bring your family. My house is warm, and the stones beneath the floor will keep everyone comfortable." The entire Morrison family moved into the Steinberg house that morning, joining the Henderson children in the refuge provided by thermal mass heating. With 12 people crowded into his 16 by 12 house, Steinberg's system faced its maximum load test, but the massive stone foundation continued performing exactly as designed. His evening fires, slightly larger to accommodate the additional body heat requirements, heated the thermal mass to its full capacity. Through the night, 8,000 pounds of heated stone released their energy steadily upward, maintaining comfortable temperatures for all 12 refugees. Morrison spent those February nights lying on Steinberg's warm stone floor, feeling heat that had been stored hours earlier radiating through his body. For the first time, he understood the sophisticated engineering behind his neighbor's wasteful foundation work. This wasn't primitive European overthinking. It was thermal mass technology that could mean the difference between life and death when normal heating methods failed against extreme conditions. The killing cold of 1887 would claim hundreds of lives across the Great Plains. But in Klaus Steinberg's sod house, 2 entire families rode out the worst winter in frontier history, warmed by stones that remembered every fire and gave back their heat when it was needed most. March brought the first tentative moderation to Buffalo County, with daytime temperatures climbing occasionally above zero and the killing wind losing some of its savage bite. As families emerged from their winter survival battles, the human cost of the Great Die-Up became grimly apparent. Buffalo County records would eventually document 23 homestead abandonment filings, families who simply could not survive another winter in houses that had failed them so catastrophically. The Henderson family returned to their own house on March 5th, but the damage was already done. Henderson had burned so much of his interior structure for fuel that the house was barely habitable, and the emotional trauma of nearly losing his children to frostbite inside their own home had broken his will to continue homesteading. By March 15th, he filed abandonment papers with the county clerk and began planning his family's return to Illinois, joining the steady stream of defeated settlers heading back east. Jim Morrison faced his own moment of reckoning as he surveyed the wreckage of his heating battle. His house had suffered structural damage from the constant burning, with smoke stains covering the interior walls and gaps in the sod where he had sacrificed building materials for fuel. But more importantly, Morrison had spent 27 nights lying on Klaus Steinberg's heated stone floor, experiencing firsthand the difference between conventional heating and thermal mass technology. On March 10th, Morrison walked across the recovering prairie to Steinberg's claim, carrying a notebook and a measuring tape. "Klaus, I need to understand exactly how your system works," he said without preamble. "I nearly lost my family this winter, and I saw yours sleeping comfortably while the rest of us burned our furniture to stay alive." Steinberg welcomed his neighbor's genuine curiosity, recognizing Morrison's conversion from skeptic to serious student. They spent the entire morning examining the thermal mass foundation, with Klaus explaining the engineering principles his Bavarian grandfather had taught him decades earlier. The massive stones stored heat at approximately 21/100ths of a BTU per pound per degree of temperature rise. With 8,000 pounds of fieldstone in his foundation, Steinberg's system could store over 1,600 BTUs for every degree his evening fire heated the stones. Morrison filled his notebook with measurements and sketches, documenting the precise dimensions of Steinberg's excavation, the thickness of the stone walls, the drainage layer composition, and the thermal mass floor construction. Most critically, he recorded the fuel efficiency data they calculated together. Steinberg's house maintained 65-degree comfort using 2 wheelbarrows of fuel daily, while Morrison's conventional system had required 6 wheelbarrows to achieve 40-degree survival conditions. The mathematics were undeniable. Steinberg's thermal mass system delivered 300% better heating efficiency than conventional sod house construction, using the same materials and fuel sources available to every homesteader. The difference lay not in superior resources, but in the application of traditional European knowledge to prairie conditions. Word of Morrison's investigation spread rapidly through Buffalo County's recovering homestead community. Dr. Whitmore, whose temperature measurements had documented the thermal mass system's performance throughout the winter, visited Steinberg in late March to conduct additional tests. Together, they heated the foundation stones to various temperatures and measured heat release duration, creating the first scientific documentation of frontier thermal mass heating. Their results confirmed what Morrison had experienced firsthand. 80-degree stone temperature provided 8 hours of comfortable heating, 90 degrees delivered 12 hours, and 100 degrees sustained warmth for 16 hours. The heated stones released their energy in a steady, controlled manner that maintained consistent interior temperatures, regardless of outside conditions or wind speed. By April, Morrison had become Steinberg's most enthusiastic advocate, telling everyone who would listen about the German immigrants' heating innovation. His conversion carried special weight because Morrison had been Steinberg's harshest critic, mocking the elaborate foundation work as European overthinking that wasted precious construction time. Now Morrison preached thermal mass gospel with the fervor of a man who had seen his family nearly freeze in a conventional house while refugees stayed warm on Steinberg's heated stone floor. The technical education began in earnest as spring allowed for construction planning. Steinberg shared the selection criteria for thermal mass stones. Dense fieldstone worked best for heat storage, with granite-like rocks preferred over softer limestone or sandstone. Size mattered too. Larger stones at the foundation base maximized heat storage capacity, while smaller stones near the surface increased the area available for heat transfer to the house interior. Most importantly, Steinberg explained the excavation requirements that his neighbors had initially dismissed as wasteful. The 4-foot depth was essential for reaching below the frost line and maximizing stone volume, while the oversized footprint allowed for thick stone walls that could store substantial heat energy. The sand and gravel drainage layer prevented moisture problems while providing stable support for the massive thermal mass above. Morrison recruited 5 other Buffalo County homesteaders to learn Steinberg's methods, forming what became known locally as the Stone Foundation Society. Through late spring and early summer, they met weekly at Steinberg's house, studying thermal mass principles and planning foundation modifications for their existing houses or entirely new construction projects. The group included Dr. Whitmore, whose scientific background helped him understand the heat transfer physics behind Steinberg's system, and 3 families whose conventional heating had failed catastrophically during the winter crisis. Each member brought different skills. Morrison contributed his practical building experience, Whitmore added scientific measurement capabilities, and the newer homesteaders provided additional labor for the intensive excavation work thermal mass foundations required. By summer 1887, 6 Buffalo County homesteaders had begun excavating thermal mass foundations using Steinberg's proven specifications. Morrison led the effort, retrofitting his existing house by excavating beneath the structure and installing a fieldstone thermal mass system. The work was backbreaking, removing tons of prairie soil and hauling hundreds of stones, but Morrison's family's near-death experience during the previous winter provided all the motivation he needed. Dr. Whitmore documented the construction process meticulously, creating detailed drawings and measurements that would eventually be published in the Nebraska State Journal. His article, titled Improved Heating Methods for Prairie Construction, described Steinberg's thermal mass system as the most significant advancement in frontier heating technology observed in this territory. The German immigrant who had been mocked for his excessive foundation preparation had become Buffalo County's most sought-after construction advisor, teaching traditional European thermal mass techniques to homesteaders desperate to avoid repeating the previous winter's survival nightmare. The knowledge that had kept his family comfortable while others burned their furniture for survival was spreading rapidly through Nebraska's homestead communities, carried by men who had learned the hard way that preparation for the worst-case scenario often determined who lived and who died when that worst case arrived. Winter. 1887 to 1888 arrived with 12 Buffalo County sod houses built on thermal mass foundations, and the contrast with the previous year's catastrophe could not have been more dramatic. When temperatures dropped to 25 below zero in late January, the families living above heated stone foundations maintained comfortable interior conditions while using 60% less fuel than conventional houses required for basic survival. Jim Morrison's retrofitted house performed nearly as well as Steinberg's original design. The massive fieldstone foundation he had excavated and installed during the summer of 1887 stored heat from his evening fires and released it steadily through the coldest nights. Morrison's family slept under normal bedding in 60-degree comfort, while his neighbors in standard sod houses still burned round-the-clock fires to achieve marginal heating. The fuel efficiency measurements Dr. Whitmore recorded that winter provided definitive scientific proof of thermal mass superiority. The 12 houses with stone foundations averaged 2.3 wheelbarrows of fuel consumption daily during February's worst cold snap, while maintaining interior temperatures averaging 61 degrees. 8 conventional sod houses in the same area burned 5.8 wheelbarrows daily to achieve interior temperatures averaging only 43 degrees. More significantly, Buffalo County recorded 0 cold-related deaths during the winter of 1887 to 1888, compared to 8 fatalities the previous year. 0 homestead abandonment filings came from families with thermal mass foundations, while 3 conventional homesteads were abandoned by settlers who could not face another winter in houses that had nearly killed them. Morrison documented his own transformation in letters to his brother in Iowa, writing with the enthusiasm of a convert who had discovered life-saving technology. "The German we called foolish has revolutionized heating on the prairie," Morrison wrote in February 1888. "His stone foundation system cuts fuel use by more than half, while keeping families comfortable in weather that previously meant fighting for survival. I was a fool to mock methods that have kept my family warm through the worst winter Nebraska can deliver." Word of the thermal mass success spread beyond Buffalo County through the networks that connected scattered homestead communities across Nebraska. Traveling preachers carried stories of the German immigrants' heating innovation to church gatherings 50 miles away. County fair demonstrations in the fall of 1888 featured detailed displays of thermal mass construction techniques, with Morrison and Steinberg explaining foundation excavation and stone selection to crowds of homesteaders planning their own heating improvements. The Nebraska State Agricultural Society took official notice of Steinberg's contribution to frontier survival technology. In 1889, they published a bulletin titled "Improved Sod House Construction for Prairie Conditions," featuring detailed technical drawings of the thermal mass foundation system. The bulletin credited traditional European masonry techniques adapted by German immigrant Klaus Steinberg, and provided step-by-step construction instructions for homesteaders across the territory. Steinberg's revelation of his method's origins added another dimension to the story that was spreading through Nebraska's immigrant communities. The thermal mass system that had saved lives during the Great Die-Up was not a new invention, but centuries-old Bavarian technology, passed down through generations of stone masons who had heated castle foundations through alpine winters far harsher than anything Nebraska offered. "My grandfather learned these methods from his grandfather," Steinberg explained to a gathering of German and Scandinavian homesteaders in 1889. "In the old country, we heated stone floors beneath great halls where noble families lived through winters that lasted 6 months. The same principles work with prairie field stone and corncob fuel. Heat the stone slowly, release the warmth through many hours." This acknowledgement of traditional knowledge opened a floodgate of immigrant expertise that had been dismissed or ignored by frontier communities focused on rapid, cheap construction. Norwegian homesteaders began sharing traditional sod-cutting techniques that created superior insulation. Swedish settlers contributed knowledge of efficient chimney design that maximized heat extraction from limited fuel. Danish immigrants taught advanced root cellar construction that used earth thermal mass for food storage. The economic impact of thermal mass adoption extended far beyond individual comfort levels. County records from 1889 showed that families with stone foundation heating systems reduced their winter fuel costs from an average of $45 per season to $18 per season. In 1889 currency, this represented savings of $675 per winter in modern purchasing power. More importantly, the reliability and efficiency of thermal mass heating enabled homestead families to remain on their claims through severe weather that had previously driven settlers back east. Buffalo County's homestead success rate increased dramatically in areas where thermal mass construction was adopted, with abandonment rates dropping from 35% to 12% between 1886 and 1890. Recognition of Steinberg's contribution to frontier survival came from unexpected quarters. The University of Nebraska sent agricultural extension agents to study his thermal mass system in 1891, documenting the construction techniques and fuel efficiency data for inclusion in their homesteading guidance materials. The State Agricultural College began teaching thermal mass principles as standard curriculum for students planning careers in frontier construction. By 1892, thermal mass foundations had become common throughout Nebraska's homestead regions, with variations adapted to local stone availability and fuel sources. The Dowse family, building their sod house near Comstock that year, incorporated Steinberg's principles into a foundation design that would later be preserved as a prime example of advanced frontier construction. The Dowse sod house, still standing and maintained by the Nebraska Historical Society, features thermal mass stones that continue to demonstrate heat storage capabilities more than 130 years after construction. Klaus Steinberg lived to see his wasteful foundation work become standard practice across Nebraska's homestead communities. When he died in 1923 at age 81, still residing in his original sod house with its thermal mass foundation, the Buffalo County Journal's obituary recognized him as the immigrant whose traditional knowledge had transformed frontier heating technology. The German stonemason once mocked for building Europe's most expensive soddy created the heating system that saved dozens of families during Nebraska's worst winter. The obituary read, "His thermal mass foundation technique became the standard for serious homesteaders who understood that preparation for extreme conditions often determines survival when those conditions arrive." Modern passive solar engineers recognize Steinberg's thermal mass system as sophisticated heat storage technology that anticipated similar systems by several decades. Energy efficiency experts calculate that his foundation design provided heating performance equivalent to an 85% efficient modern furnace, achieved using only prairie materials and agricultural waste fuel. The German immigrant who spent a month digging stones when others built houses in days had created one of the most energy-efficient heating systems in 19th century America. The fundamental lesson of Klaus Steinberg's thermal mass innovation remains relevant today. Traditional knowledge, dismissed as old-fashioned or excessive by those focused on speed and economy, often contains survival wisdom that becomes invaluable when normal methods fail against extreme conditions.